Welcome to this conversation with Ramesh, who I had the pleasure of interviewing in his studio many years ago. And then he, and Tunti and her son came to UConn to exchange the visit and did a really wonderful talk at my university with my students, really memorable. And so it was great to have this chance to look at his work. And I put a few images up on the screen just because, as someone myself who works in watercolor and used to work very large and now works very small, I think that the scale, most people don't expect watercolor to be this large. You know, working at this scale seems to be in the realm of oil or acrylic painting. So I just wanted to show a few, a few images from the show. Just, I think it's important to get an idea for those who haven't seen the show, an idea of the scale of the works. And then I've organized groups of works to talk about based on things that I was most drawn to in terms of work. And again, as a fellow painter. And let's see. And I think one thing I wanted to talk about in terms of pairing, I think you see the two that I'm going to talk about to begin with on the left. And I really wanted to talk about the contrast of these different styles of work that you're working with. And I've used the invitation for this lovely image on the left, which is on the sense of pure white paper. And then on the right, we have this image that has a lot of overlay, almost from day to night. And so I'm just kind of bringing up this idea of the contrast between the work as a kind of a way to direct the discussion. And also moving into this triptych. And I think the one thing I'm focusing on this work, again, so you can see the scale of this, and again, giving you a close up, because there are particular things I was fascinated in this particular body of work. And let me just go to the next image. And I was really struck by this particular image. Again, this incredible I would call hyper real. And sort of in the 80s, what I remember as a student, that was when watercolor kind of came out of the realm of kind of weekend painters, or the kind of the amateur realm, and all started to echo the huge space of other kinds of contemporary painting. And so where watercolor used to be the Sunday, let's say the Sunday painter's medium at small scale, all of a sudden you started seeing watercolors in exhibitions, certainly in New York and other places, that were at a very, very large scale. And so watercolor seemed at that point to enter the realm and the art market of other types of work. Unfortunately, what gallery dealers used to talk about was that, I'm sorry, I have to admit people where I'm not a good multitasker. Trying to go back. Was this, again, this echoing the scale of we'd say kind of major art and museums. And sorry, I'm distracted by having to let people in while trying to carry on a train of thought. Okay, somebody else. And so what I wanted to talk about was this combination of this kind of pure white paper, because I think one thing, I'm teaching watercolor right now also, one thing that's a characteristic of watercolor is the white of the paper. That unless you're using gouache, that when you're painting with transparent watercolor, the white of the paper is the white of the page. And so we have this contrast of images where, like on the left, I call this a hibiscus series, where you're using the pure white of the paper and working transparently. And then we have what I was fascinated by, if you look at the image on the left of the flowers in the jar, and then if we look at this image, which was chosen to be used on the catalog page, it's kind of turned in a different angle, which is also fascinating in terms of how it works. But we're seeing this kind of hyper realistic detail. And then we're seeing it again on the right, if you recognize it's the same image, but you're overlaying it with the jars that they're in. And that's an observation I'm making. And I just wanted to talk about that a little bit more, because then we have an image like this, in which again, you have that hyper reality of the images that you feel like you can almost touch them. But then this more kind of schematic, realistic in a different way of the jar overlaid. And we come to an image like this too, and we have that same kind of really interesting point of contrast where this hyper real image, the viewer feels like they could reach out and touch. And because we have seen the images at a large scale, we know that these are actual at life size, if not larger than life size. And so as an artist, I'm fascinated by your technique. And many of these pieces that I just showed, where you're taking this hyper real object and having a lot of things that lay over it are overlaid. And I was just wondering, I know it's a technical thing, and I know that as a fellow artist, sometimes people get focused on talking about the concepts, but I think a lot of times viewers are really interested in how the technique of the work drives the content, and how you go back and forth from images that again have a sense of purity of image on paper. That's one of the major characteristics of watercolor. And then you have other fascinating images. I want to get to this one a little later. So could you talk maybe a little bit about how the technique, how you go back and forth from this kind of, again, pure hyper real image on paper to images that overlay that, how you're kind of conceptualizing that and how technically it's working for you?
Thank you, Kathryn. Good morning, Kathryn. Good to see you again, I should say. You perhaps have pointed out issues which have concerned me, but which nobody has actually raised, because as you said, most people are kind of get embroiled in the concept or the conceptual reasons behind doing certain works. Technique has been important for me, but not to the extent of being a means to an end. Having said that, let me tell you, watercolor has never been my forte. I've always detested doing watercolors precisely because it had these well-laid rules and regulations, as you were talking about the purity of the white paper, which has to be maintained at any cost, which was told. It was one of the dictums that when one does watercolor, one should not mess up the colors because they become muddy.
Yeah.
And which I inevitably did, which I could do, say, in my large oil paintings. One could play around, put layers of colors, remove them, and that was the fun of painting. So I was always a bit hesitant to approach or do watercolor. I never did watercolor seriously, even as a student in Baroda, where I studied. But what happened perhaps a few years ago is that I said, now that there are no rules and regulations, I can actually play around with watercolors and break all rules. So perhaps a whole body of work which you're seeing here are partially pure watercolor and also partially watercolor and gouache. Because gouache gives me a kind of freedom to paint the way I would do an oil. So in a way, a lot of technical concerns and technical aspects have entered these watercolors, which have come from my earlier oil painting techniques of layering, of perhaps using, as you said, super realistic image, and at the same time enabling the image to kind of disintegrate into lines or disintegrate into fields of energy, as I see it. I mean, things are not what they are. Things are not always static. They become something else, or they just kind of disintegrate. I mean, when you see this triptych, I had envisaged it as 3 realistically painted images of the hibiscus buds. The center one was meant to be the flowers blooming. And the third one was the same thing.
This is the one. Yeah, this is the one.
Yeah, this is the one.
So that was an earlier stage when you must have photographed this when it was an earlier stage, and then you layered it.
Yes.
You layered it with the jar on the right.
And the jar on the right. It came later. But if you see the center work, the center panel, the flowers are not painted. I mean, realistically.
Yeah, they're more
suggestive. They just become a mass of red color.
Yeah.
Oscillating with a kind of energy, which seemed to be quite appropriate. So there's this constant juxtaposition of something which is absolute, painted as it is, with something which is fluid, which is
Okay.
constantly changing. As I see the world, that's how I understand the world. Big things are never what they are. So this is kind of taking a concept into a painterly area, or an area where one has to translate this one's concepts and concerns into ways of uh, converting them into paint or
Well, it
images,
almost
or the
seems
way one uses a bit.
it almost seems to me that some of the lines, like the
Huh.
elliptical lines, almost seem to
Huh.
be whirling, almost like fields of energy,
Yes.
as opposed to containing. Because normally, what I like about this work is it has this sort of ordinary resonance that anyone might see in their kitchen of hibiscus.
Yes.
They almost could look like, peppers, sort of in a
Yes.
jar, maybe to be used in cooking or something.
Yes.
But at the same
Yes.
time, we have instances where on the right, they're sort of breaking out of
Yeah.
that space, or
Yeah.
the space is sort of whirling around them. So the thing that contains them seems to be something that is immaterial in some ways. And for me, that's really kind of a beautiful metaphor. But I know that most things come back to your interests in Kabir and the religious poetry that you connect with. And I think that you talk a lot also about the beauty of the ordinary and the kind of sense
Yes.
of the spiritual in the ordinary act of containing flowers in a jar. And so it seems to me that there are a lot of ways one could approach it. And I think painters have kind of an inside knowledge sometimes. And when I gave a talk about Sujith's work at Icon Gallery as a watercolorist, I could sort of point out technical things that were technical achievements. Certainly someone like, Indrapramit Roy is an amazing watercolor painter also.
Yes.
And in terms of the sheer difficulty, because most people, certainly my students right now, feel that watercolor is one of the most difficult mediums to master because there's only one direction. Again,
Yes, it certainly is.
Yeah, if you care about preserving the beauty of the white paper, there's only one direction you can go. And so it, the kind of experimentation and painting and erasing that a lot of artists like is not possible with watercolor. And also, ironically, and I learned this from a gallery dealer many years ago, is that there's another certain level of sacrifice because works on paper tend to sell for less than oil works on canvas, and then you have to frame them, and there's huge expenses and even showing these. And other people I know that work in large watercolor have talked about that. So to make something in watercolor, if you can also make something in oil, which obviously you can in other mediums, is that I'm just really interested in that choice. And I was just sort of wondering if it had to do with the sense of containment during COVID, because when you're working in oil, sometimes you're standing back, maybe away from the wall, and you've got this
Yes.
canvas, and there's an intimacy with working on watercolor because it's a different action of working very close to the paper. And I was just wondering if that feeling of containment that we all have had during COVID also was
I think there was certainly a sense of intimacy, in the sense that one was much closer to the paper or the sheet of paper, and one would not go back a few feet to see how things are shaping up. I mean, one would sit before it and contemplate and curse it because it was not coming right. But that was it. It was just a very close encounter with your work, always, till you reach the point of when you felt that the work was over. So there was, so as I was telling people, and I was also talking, this was the first time that after the work was framed and hung in the gallery, I saw it for the first time in 15 days or 10 days when I came to Delhi. And I was surprised to come across areas which actually delightfully surprised me, which I had never thought were possible in paint, or the kind of emotional responses they could elicit, even out of me, having seen them all alone when I took a solitary walk in the gallery and kind of paused before each work. And that was quite pleasurable and delightful, I would say. And I thought, yes, I did a fairly good job, patted myself on it. But no, but what I would like to share here is I bring in a lot of oil painting ways of rendering things into watercolor and gouache. And perhaps if I get back to oil now, I'll take back what I have done in watercolors to oil.
Mm-hmm.
So there'll be this exchange or kind of osmosis between two different processes, between two different mediums. I'm trying to get back to oil because it's been quite a while since I've done my large oil painting.
Mm-hmm.
And once I get back, perhaps areas of transparency, the way I use lines in a watercolor might not be possible in a larger oil painting. But yes, it's something to look forward for. What can happen?
Also, in this piece, I mean, I was, going from pieces that were, again, using a lot of white paper to ones that are more intensely worked. And, because you were looking at a vase of flowers, and behind that is a jar too. So, and all the flowers are in the point of kind of at the end of their bloom, but they still have this, again, this gorgeous luminosity, but you have much more dense layers here also. So is this where and again, you're kind of relinquishing the white paper, and it looks like you're bringing the white back in. Is the white of still the white of the paper? Or is it brought back in with gouache or?
Some of the works, the white of the paper is retained because I was consciously aware of the fact that I was doing watercolors. But I should never forget the fact that I was doing watercolors. So perhaps keeping the sanctity of, if there's a word called sanctity or purity in medium, to have a few works where the white is kind of sacrosanct, is maintained. And hence the two works which you showed, the contrast, the dark gray and the white, where the white was not touched. It was just the image which was painted. Yes, even the triptych, the jars were not painted earlier. They were just the three images which were painted. And then, because one felt the need, because the space was quite daunting, all this white space left untouched.
The terror of the white page, you know it well,
So it leaves you with sleepless nights. So everything else came. Well, but yes, the idea that the white is important was at the back of my mind. Some of the works, not all. Some have been overloaded with pigment and imagery and lines to the point of exhaustion.
Well, we know also, as with watercolor paper, it has a certain life, but if you abuse it too much, it will pretty much, disintegrate too. So
this paper, fortunately, is what they call it 300 GSM, which means it can take a whole lot of paper.
Take a lot.
So most of the works have probably had a dozen baths, one layer of color, it goes to the bathroom and the shower goes on it, in that sense. So you kind of wash over the paint and it leaves you with a faint stain of the earlier image. So that's how a way of building up a painted field, or a way of building up an image.
So again, we had a chance to see a piece like this. I showed the gallery view just so people could appreciate how immense it is, and in a certain sense, larger than life scale. And again, like the hibiscus series, you're kind of enclosing this plant in a jar, but it has even almost more of a supernatural feeling to me, because the way the jar is floating and the way that's almost floating in this realm of light, again, with that white of the watercolor paper and the quality and brightness of that paper, emits a kind of light. And I always tell my students, just think the paper has to breathe. You can't cover up the paper. And it's also, when you're working with one medium, there's no reason to make it do what another medium can do better. And so it's the transparency of watercolor that makes it what it is. And if the piece starts to lose that, then there's sometimes students will move to acrylic.
I'm glad you pointed it out, because at some point I realized that the white of the paper need not be just the white of a paper, a blank sheet of paper left untouched. It can assume, it can become light, in the sense that the white actually illuminates the images which are in it, in a sense. So I think this work specifically, it was not just white left untouched, the paper. It was also, as you said, for me, I mean, it felt as if it was illuminated with the whiteness of the paper. The dried up canna flowers, as well as the canna flower which is in full bloom. Somebody is showing you, look at this. And then the light comes, and then you see whatever is revealed. So in that sense, one became aware of the fact that the white can play a very vital role, and not just be left out as a rule, which is done in watercolors, but the white becomes a very significant component of the whole work, in the sense that
these lines that you're making over, almost when I first saw the works, I almost felt like they were printed, like etched lines. I guess that's due to the fineness of the way the lines are rendered. And so I was wondering if there are multimedia effects that you were using in terms of watercolor and printmaking, or if it's all the linear works that we're seeing, the ghost lines that are all on the left, or even the ghost line of the jar on the right. That's all rendered with gouache and watercolor.
They all ended with gouache and watercolor, but I tell you how I arrived at the lines. Seeing one of my students, I used to be a teacher, I mean, I've retired now, playing around with an image on the computer in a Photoshop, one realized that at some point an image can be broken up into so many different components, like lines. And to me, it was amazing to see this static, full-fledged image suddenly turning into something like pixels or dots or lines. It's almost as if you remove the outer skin and you're peeping or peering into these energy fields oscillating within the actual structure. I started using it with a whole lot of forms. I think it also gave me a sense that these painted images were animated by using these lines, rather than merely remaining static.
I almost feel like they're moving. Like it's like if you're looking at an animation and you see kind of past, present, and future, and you almost see you're almost visualizing the past. And I think it's very striking, because I think it would have been an interesting technique alone to create an active surface, but in contrast with the jar, in which the other one seems again floating within this real otherworldly light. Whether it's the rebirth of that, or that something was saved through maybe an environmental catastrophe, and one of these flowers was saved, for so many different ways that one can approach this work.
Strangely, all the images which you see in this body of work are objects in the studio, and the plants are potted plants in the studio. So there's not been images which I have imagined or sourced outside. In that sense, they were there. And I was telling you to kind of imbue them with a sense of purpose, a sense of deep emotional resonances. They assume, or they become something much larger or of much more importance than they actually are. They seem to become. I mean, that's what I assume.
Well, it's because of the way you contrast them with
yes, it's also the way this is what I feel, and I have to find means to render them into something which the audience would find, would probably feel the same kind of emotional impact which I feel. I was telling somebody like this painting, which took a lot of time. There was this.
Is this the one we're on the screen here, or the other one?
Yeah, the one which is on the screen.
Okay.
There's one which is painted. There's one which is done with lines. A brief story about it. It's a marigold plant which was curved and bent, I don't know why, in a pot. I thought it was a beautiful curve. I wanted to paint it. So I started it. And after I finished the line drawing, the plant one overnight, it just shriveled, dried up.
Wow.
Finished. It was almost as if it was waiting for me to finish, depicting it or painting it so that it can vanish. To me, it seems like some lives are there, which are there. We don't even know why and they just vanish, and it actually left a deep emotional impact on me, in consonance with what was happening in the outside world. I mean,
I'm curious
there was
about
this
your
whole,
doubling, that you doubled, with the reason for doubling the image to with the sepia on
yeah,
one
the
side.
sepia, it's almost something which is solid, disappears. It's almost like become a fossil.
Yeah.
I mean, one moment it's there, the next moment it might just vanish. That was the idea, as with lives.
You know what it looks to me when I
Right?
first saw the image, because I was seeing just, JPEGs of it. It looks like a hand holding this bowl.
Yes, but also, I mean, yes, holding something which is fragile, beautiful, and useful. A ball, it's a ceramic ball, which is
Yeah.
thing. Um, life is so fragile, Kathryn, that we don't even know. I mean, in this pandemic, I've lost people whom I have known, friends. So there was this sense of uncertainty. There was a sense that what we took for granted is not, it's not certain. The people who were there who disappeared everywhere. One heard of people who were friends, people who were known, and also one heard, I mean, one reads newspaper reports, everything.
Yeah.
So perhaps all this in a way added to the way the images, some of the images have turned out. I don't think I actually mulled over the great tragedy which was happening, but yes, one was aware of what was happening and they became a part of
I think it evokes it so beautifully. I'm fascinated by this image. I wanted to ask you about
this. I've collected this whole bunch of terracotta painted lacquer dolls.
Oh.
One of them being an old policeman. Okay. Now, the idea, I mean, it's a very kind of naive, cliched idea of state power or power over or lording over or suppressing something which is delicate, beautiful, precious, can be separate. So the idea of a policeman, I thought was very appropriate to paint it. And I wanted to paint each doll and an appropriate still life next. That was the idea. I thought I could do it. But I think only the cop worked. The next I've tried, it never worked with the other dolls for some reason. I mean,
it's so curious because you really made it. I mean, it looks like a plastic thing. I mean, one thing about your work, what works so well is you have this incredible skill. And so because you have this incredible skill,
these skills can take you, Kathryn, I know, I always try, sometimes, most of the time, I try to downplay it also precisely because then people get very taken aback by the skills rather than what.
But it allows you this range. It allows you this contrast because with this piece, I mean, I love that big white splat that comes down the middle of it, but
yes,
sense of contrast that you can go in either extreme. And so that, but the idea that you can actually render that reflectiveness of the plastic, if we thought this was a real person, the whole piece doesn't work unless we know that that's plastic. And so I always say to not downplay that level of skill that you have to make these things look three-dimensional because it's also, again, your touch is so delicate. And I think it comes out, and I love your oil paintings also, as you know, but I think that exquisite touch comes out even more so in watercolor. And for anyone who's painted watercolor too, it's like we always say, that's the Olympics of painting. It's the triple jump of painting.
I know. I am a bit tired. I was telling Tunti or somebody that I'm a bit tired now of watercolors and peering into the paper. I need this to go back.
The vigorousness, you probably miss the vigorousness of oil painting.
Yes, in a way, I kind of, sometimes the idea of actually attacking a canvas when things don't work out, which is such a gratifying thing, which
it's
I cannot
also
do
a body thing. When you're painting, it's like you're standing there moving your arm, and in watercolors, I know
and which
on top of the surface. But they're just such exquisite things in this piece that I love, like how the flowers almost disappear into the background really simply because of the value relationships that umber color behind the green. It's such a subtle color relationship, and it's so quiet. And so in a way, you're able to direct the
strangely enough,
soldier and then the flowers.
I've never used such delicate hues ever before, you know, but that, and they have come in the watercolors. And also when I started this whole series of still lives, which is very strange,
Yeah.
there was this conviction in my mind that I wanted to do a series of pretty happy pictures. Times being what they were, you know, I mean, cruel times. I said, I want to do a happy, actually delightful, cheerful picture. And what better than a bunch of flowers, you know, flowers.
Yeah.
So it was like something which I told myself. Yet, they have
But
not
it's
turned
also,
out to be happy.
it's challenging to paint flowers. I mean, we're probably familiar with the beauty of botanical illustrations
Yes.
or flowers
So,
rendered in miniature paintings, Islamic
yes,
miniature especially. And so it's how to take this that could be in somebody else's hands, a very conventional painting, especially for watercolor.
exactly.
Watercolor has to work twice as hard to kind of be taken seriously.
You kind of oscillate between your botanical realism to something which is cloyingly beautiful.
Yes.
You know, so to be able to walk a path in between.
Yes.
Something happened. I suppose maybe this is the nearest I came to painting a beautiful, delicate flower in most of the work.
And maybe, yeah.
Others, you know, in that sense. Huh.
I think another thing that, and about being a watercolor painter is for every medium that we work in, there's problem solving. And that's what I have friends who say, my work's not about anything. It's about problem solving. And so,
yes, and it's a problem we set. Exactly, Kathy. It's a problem we set for ourselves. And we go about arriving at a solution or a plausible solution.
Well, I think also that's the reason that it's hard to work in two meetings at the same time, because problem solving in oil painting is different than problem solving in watercolor.
Exactly.
And once you get into the zone of that, that's all you're thinking about.
Yes. There are areas in these works which are so similar to the way I would probably do an oil painting.
Yeah.
You know, in this. So it's like so overloaded with pigment. And I have been using watercolor cakes, but I have also been using pigment colors, you know, mixed with gum, Arabic gum.
Okay.
So it kinds of adds a body to the whole layer of paint.
Yes.
I mean, you can touch it, and you know, which is really nice, which is to me very akin to using oil paint. So in that sense, I was in a kind of comfort zone because I was using pigment, and yes, it allowed other possibilities which I would probably not have got purely with, say, using just watercolors.
Are these pieces that started off again on the white paper and then you built them up, or did you conceptualize
yes,
them
I kind of,
begin with?
Because you were already so tuned to layering them up, cluttering things. That's how they arrive. It's only somewhere midway when the work started that one realized the importance of the white spaces.
Yeah.
So by the time I came to the end of the series, there were a lot more works where the whites were more prominent. Like
and the whites look like that you went back in with gouache for the whites here with that.
Yes.
Linear, yeah. I love the combination of the way you're describing them with just ghost outlines, the linear forms, and then the more dense kind of almost three-dimensional forms in both of them. And that color saturation is just so intense that how they're imbued with this saturation of a color field that kind of permeates the entire piece, not just parts of the image.
And strange, I mean, how everything led to one. I thought of doing one work, which led to two, which eventually led to 14 works. And
that's what I was trying to kind of organize my arrangement of your work here is ones that go from this pure space to more dense and dense. And here where here we're still seeing something distinguishable between the flowers and the ground, even if you're starting to fuse them together. By the time we get to these images, again, everything is almost disintegrating, which is, I think, is again a wonderful metaphor based on how they're arranged here. But we have these rich fields of color, and almost that we're kind of struggling to see the forms. But because we see the other work in context, we understand what we're seeing if we can't see it.
And what happened also was the fact that I don't work on a single painting at a time. It was a habit always, even with oils, even with water. There were 4 works simultaneously which were being worked on. So I would flit from one to the other when I got bored or when something was not happening here. So perhaps there were areas where ideas of one work would creep into the other.
Okay.
I know in that sense, it did. I mean, I think it does, because
Then we get to a piece like this, and it's sort of, you go from day
this,
to nighttime. Where there's an evocation of like almost a midnight light
yes.
at nighttime when you wake up in the middle of the night and you see this kind of ghostly light when you're kind of struggling
Yes.
across the room to get to the bathroom or something. And it's a unique light that we don't see very often, like almost like a moonlight.
Yes. This painting actually followed the one with the cop. I had a figure here of a woman in white, there was this very strange doll I had of a woman in wet sari holding a pot. Now it's a very cliched image used perhaps in most Indian calendars and popular pictures. So for me, it was a kind of challenge. How does one make it not respectable, but part of one's own vocabulary, this image? So this woman was actually painted here, and I thought I would get perhaps a vase of white lilies or some such thing. It never worked. And then it was washed and washed and washed till it became so messy. The only way I could retrieve the work was actually by using a lot of grays and dark lines. I mean, I could have just thrown the painting away and said, I'm done with it. I cannot do it any further. But I mean, there was nothing to lose. So I said, let me see how much more one can get anything out of this.
So
I'm quite fond of this. I'm quite fond of this.
By nearly destroying a painting, you've kind of brought it back to life.
Yes. And that was a good lesson learned, that there are no paintings which are failed paintings. A little bit of patience, if one has it, it comes back
That's what I tell my students, so they don't
in a new avatar.
And painting in watercolor, I said there are no mistakes. There are only things that happen to take the painting into a different direction, because once you've invested the money to paint in watercolor in this paper, which is expensive, and it has to be good paper because it's impossible to paint on poor painting. And so there's no mistakes. It's just so there's no throwing it away and wasting that expensive piece of paper. You take it into a different direction. So is what you've done. You've wiped out the figure that made it a little hokey, it sounds like, and made it into something that's, this haunting moonlight.
Which I had never thought of. This is something which I used to tell my students, that if you're very conscious that you should not make a mistake, then you will never make a painting. Because you're perpetually aware of the fact that is the line right, is the tone right, or is the hue right? You will not do it. If you make mistakes, as you said, the paper could be expensive, things could be expensive, but it still takes you in a new direction.
Right. And that's the important thing about watercolor, is such a difficult medium that having poor materials makes a difficult medium even harder. But this morning, Chunti sent me these images. I'm glad that she sent them, because I was going to end my presentation on this nighttime scene, but these I know were earlier and than the pre-pandemic work. But I was just, again, struck by them kind of going back to this, again, this sense of the painting on the pure white paper. And I guess it points out your incredible versatility as an artist. Some people can do, one thing, and they might do that one thing really, really well, but you have this incredible versatility as a painter. And so I thought it was kind of nice to end on this image, because it's what we started with too, that, and I was always fascinated in India by these bags of flowers that I saw in a lot of places, a whole photo series on them. And it was explained that they're usually things that are left by devotees, maybe by street signs or something.
Yes. That's how they came.
And there's a visceral sense about them. So they're kind of attractive and repulsive at the same time, because one doesn't know of what it actually is, that it's actually flowers or.
And a whole lot of things which we package in plastic, from devotion to desires to food to everything, which can be, of course, later marketed.
Well, they're breathtakingly beautiful, and particularly the middle one, where that plastic almost disappears against the white paper. Again, the subtlety.
Actually, it does, and there's just a hint of a dead fish inside.
Yeah.
It's actually a fish,
Fish, huh?
a slice of a fish.
Wow.
And actually it disappears. There's hardly,
Yeah.
by the time it goes up. So these were also games which one plays with oneself to keep myself amused when I'm painting. I need
Yeah.
as to suddenly you take off at some point and see what one can do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the possibilities of using paint in different ways or
Yeah.
saying things in a different way, which I suppose most painters do, in the sense that you don't really follow a set of instructions when you start painting, that I'm going to
Right.
do
It's
this,
kind of
this,
knowing, it's knowing when to stop.
Um,
If it's watercolor, because
yes,
you can't
yeah,
reverse things. I mean, if
yes,
you could
no,
reverse it like you did in the other one, but you have a totally
yes,
different painting. And so if one
yes. But one
wants
should
to
also
preserve
be,
that pure white of the paper, there's only one direction. And so I guess that was the last piece. And I think we can open it up to questions. I just wanted to, because I have any of these images up here, and I did make a selection of images. I know that you have a lot more
yes,
images in the show, but I selected ones that I wanted to have our conversation about. And so if anyone would like to unmute themselves and ask any questions or discuss any particular image that I can go back to, or I could stop screen sharing, we could just look at each other, however, Tunti, however you feel like we should proceed next.
thank you, Kathryn, for that
Thank you,
wonderful.
Ramesh.
That was very
Thank
wonderful.
both of you. Thank you both of you for this very, very nice talk. This level of comfort that we've shared over the years, thanks to the hospitality we shared with you, Kathryn, many years ago.
Yes.
Thanks. And I'm enjoying seeing so many of my friends in the audience here that I miss very much, since I have not been able to get back to India yet, but hopefully by next year I can come back.
Yes. Yes.
For all these beguilingly beautiful surfaces, there is some underlying level of uncomfort, there's a level of violence, there's something disturbing about the images. Was this because of the pandemic or prior to the pandemic as well? Because as we see in the packet works that we saw on the last slide,
Yeah.
this has been part of your vocabulary for a while now.
Yes, Tunti, I think, as you said, it's been a while since I've been using images which seem to be exquisitely rendered and they're beautiful. But I'm aware of the fact in life, as in images, that there is an underlying sense of disquiet and violence which can explode any moment. We have seen it. We see it every day. If you read the newspapers, it's how life is made of, and this is how one has to take it. At least be aware of it, that there are no certainties in life. Any moment, things can go totally haywire. So I suppose this is the sense which kind of is at the back of my mind when I paint all these images.
Thank you. Gives an insight into
Yeah.
So I suppose that's that. And
Anyone has any questions, or you can unmute yourselves.
my dear friend Indo.
Yeah, it's not a question at all. It is more an observation. And I think it has been very nice to, again, I will echo what Kathryn said, nice to be among friends.
Yes.
After so many days and months and what have you.
Yeah.
And it's also very nice to get a sort of close-up view of the works. I am familiar with many of them, but unfortunately seeing them on screen is very different. I wish I could see them in the real. I would like to, I'd love to at some point. And enough has been said about the technique, about the concept. I think I don't really have anything to add there. I will just say this, that as a fellow artist and a fellow teacher, I just feel very amazed and taken by the fact that, as Ramesh yourself was referring to this idea, the idea has been a stock in trade. It is not a new idea of looking the parable of the life reflected in the bud blooming and then eventually wilting. This is something that has been done to death. But the fact of the matter is that when I look at your works, this whole new old concept is presented in a manner which makes me absolutely, stand still. It's sort of, they're riveting images. The fact that you've managed to pull this out of your hat is something that sort of stuns me. That this really old, hackneyed, as you have self-deprecatingly mentioned, yes, is a rather old idea, is completely reinvented and presented in a way. And that is what good art is all about. It sort of makes you look at your presence, and ideas don't necessarily age. What does is how we deal with it. So there is this old idea, and it is thought about and worked on in this tremendously charged, very powerful, very, I would say, communicative kind of a language, which is at the same time very bold and very sensitive. And that I found the most amazing thing in this body of works. You've mentioned, I know you are very comfortable doing large works in both oil and watercolor. You've always dealt with human figures admirably. And you yourself have admitted during one of our long telephonic discussions that this is the first time that you're attempting something to do with a still life. And still life as a genre has an almost inbuilt thing about, talking about the plenitude of life and also the finiteness of life. The fact that we are in this transient mode. And so those are not, anything radical or new or earth-shattering. But what is the power of the image? And it just goes on to prove that even an idea that has been with us for a very long time can really be reinvented with such amazing freshness that it can hit you, it can move you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Indo, for those kind words, if I may say so. Yes, I would still reiterate that I think an artist's commitment is the passion which he can imbue his images with. He has to. That's about the only way I think you can pass it on to the viewer. That's it. There are no two other ways. That one has to feel the intensity of an idea or the concept here before it goes into the paper or canvas, and that's it.
You've done it admirably.
Right. So,
any other questions or comments? Thank you for that contribution, Indra Pramit.
yes.
Pradosh Mishra always has really
Oh,
insightful
is he there?
things to say. He is definitely there. I saw him.
I wish I could wave to him and say, hi, hello, Pradosh.
Yeah, good evening.
Good evening. You're right.
Pradosh.
Good evening. It's evening for
Hi,
everybody.
Pradosh.
Hi. How are you? Yeah, it's
Namaskar.
good to come back, and it's so nice. In fact, it is all amazing to look at your works, and I have been following you very closely during the pandemic, and you have been posting them on Facebook and Insta. So I have a close look at that. But like Indra said, I really appreciated the way you didn't speak about the pandemic much, because Kathryn very
Yes.
cleverly took your point of technicalities into the point, and took it that way. But what I found, like if you look at the compositions with the jars and kind of the life of flowers in a cyclic way, I find that they're very, impactive as we look at it in a sense that, it is like as if people are all, put into their own houses with a transparent look and, in a sense, like you are there, people are visible. Like you said, they disappeared. So many people disappeared from around us. And, the way we are looking at these images, much of them, the kind of certainty and uncertainty which are, visible through your works of art, in the entire body of works that you have done, seemingly, they're very moving and they're very impactful. So, but we didn't talk much about that, except that, you talked about it a bit with Tunti when she gave her observation. So can you please tell us a little more about that? Did you actually have a feeling as such, or it just came out as naturally?
Well, now that you actually asked, I confess to Kathryn that when the pandemic started, hello,
Yeah.
Okay. Do you hear me, Pradosh?
Yes.
Yeah, I do.
Okay, fine. When the pandemic started, as I was telling Kathryn, I was very conscious of the fact of the tragedy unfolding in the outside world. And I specifically wanted to do happy paintings, which is how I started. But at the same time, there was a smaller tragedy unfolding in my own home. My mother had a stroke and she fell down and hit her head. I saw her lying in a pool of blood and I was terrified. And we couldn't take her to a hospital because all the hospitals were COVID hospitals. So we had to stay put at home, take care of her and see how it goes. So there was this double thing of what was going outside was being reflected in the house. So perhaps these two anxieties, so as to say, seeped into my own way of looking at everything around. In fact, a doctor who happened to come home told me your mother is going to live for another week. So I said, yes, I mean, she's still alive. She's fine now. The stroke has had its effect, but she's fine. But to have gone through those moments of anxious, despair of what was happening outside and what was happening at home. And I think I was able, in a sense, to channelize these moments of despair and desolation into my work. Not consciously, but perhaps they have come.
Yeah, they've creeped in somehow.
I mean, that's about all I can say.
Yeah. But at the same time, what actually I really liked about this entire body of works is that the kind of meticulous, organization in a kind of an order in disorder, if you can say that, the way they come into their row onto your sheet of paper and the way it reveals itself. It's quite an amazing work because sometimes you're very meticulous at drawing things into a, hyper realism, like Kathryn says, but at sometimes you have intentionally avoided to put those factors into the work. So, that kind of creates a magic and allows someone to, penetrate into those layers of, the depiction of the form. So that was quite amazing, but I'm really impressed. Thank you so much for
thank you, Pradosh, for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Those
I'm
great
really
words from an art history professor too, really.
Yes, I know.
Two painters talking about each other. We'll talk about brush strokes and things, but we need the art historian to give us the bigger picture.
So that was that. And Kathryn, I hope to see you very soon. And I know you love masala dosas. There are all those masala dosas waiting for you. at home.
I make a dosa every Sunday. It's my dosa
Oh,
day.
great.
Yeah.
He actually
that's
does.
Yeah, and I'm once we get into winter, I'll get back into lentil season. For some reason, I don't eat
Oh, great.
lentils in the summer, only the winter. So it's the only thing I'm looking forward to, cold weather, so I can start my lentil.
So,
Yeah, I have a whole
see, I mean,
South Indian cookbook.
good. Good.
But you're still, Kathryn, you're still roaming in your garden, so it's so beautiful.
I am. The
Yes.
garden is that we've had a very warm fall. We seem to be having colder springs and warmer falls, and so it's there's been no frost yet, so that's absolutely gorgeous.
May I make a brief comment, please?
Yes.
This is Belinda Dhanoa. Hi, Ramesh.
Hi, Belinda.
And I hope to be able to, still hope to be able to see the show maybe on the last day, the 16th. I think that you never really got away from your initial intent to make happy, beautiful pictures, because even though one can see the decay, one can see the idea of memento mori here, it's done with a grace and with such beauty that I don't think you actually moved completely away from your initial intent. It seems to be also an acceptance of a certain kind of decay, of death, of things moving on, the
Yes.
transient nature again. You know, so I'm really looking forward to seeing these paintings.
Thank you.
That was my comment. Yeah.
Thank you, Bing. I hope your foot is all right.
Well, it's on its way to recovery, Ramesh. Thanks.
Good. Speedy recovery. Thank you, Bing.
Ramesh, can I make an observation? This is Padma
Yes.
here.
Oh, hi.
Padma.
Yes.
Okay.
Ah.
So I just wanted to, I mean, this is just an observation of having seen your work over the years. And I feel that it's always been a sense of the temporal which you bring into your work. You know, the space is used in such a way that it is not only very disquieting and at the same time personal. Maybe that's why it is difficult sometimes to view your work. And like somebody else also said, everyone takes away different feelings, different vibes from your work. For me, it has always been a very personal experience. Whenever I see it, I also find a sense of disquiet. Maybe you never, you never kind of got into a place where you could paint happy things. And I wish I could see some of your happy images. I'm really looking forward to that. And I love the way you deal with the temporal and with the space on your works. That's
Thank you.
That's my experience.
Thank you.
Thanks for this lovely talk.
Yes. Thank
Thank
you
you,
all for
Kathryn.
being here with
Everybody.
us. And
Thanks.
thank you.
I'm
Tunti.
sorry that as painters are sometimes we have lack of technical skills and we weren't able to live stream it, but we have a recording and which I'll send over to the gallery. And so that can maybe be posted for people who had to miss it. Certainly I'll play it
Yes.
again for my own students since I'm teaching watercolor this semester. It's a nice opportunity for me to be able to share our conversation with them and your works too. So
Well, on that note,
yes.
Kathryn, thank you once again. And Tunti, thank you for everything you've done and for having arranged this meeting.
Yes, thanks so much for
with Kathryn.
inviting me.
Yes.
Again, I wish I could have been there. And so next time, have another show. I'll let you when I'm coming back, and so we can do the
Yes,
conversation in
yes,
person.
yes.
Absolutely.
So that we can continue our conversation.
It's
from
great to
here.
see
We
Tunti in
went
the
to-
gallery because she's sitting right in front of that painting. So you really, again,
Okay.
get a wonderful sense of
Yes.
scale.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ramesh, for this
All right.
beautiful
Thank
show.
Hi, everybody.
All who attended.
Bye. Have a good
Yes.
evening. I know it's dinner time for all of you. So in India, maybe.
After that lovely conversation, it's time for the sundowner. The sun has been
Yes.
down long back.
Yeah, yeah.
So, so that's that.
All right.